Welcome back to Minds Matter, a podcast sponsored by the Monash Center for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies. I'm Ava.
And I'm Beth. And on Minds Matter, we explore research from neuroscience and psychology while occasionally talking through our own personal experiences.
This week on the podcast, I spoke to Dr. Nina Lauharatanahirun, who is an assistant professor of biobehavioral health and biomedical engineering at Penn State University. Nina's research draws from a bunch of different domains, so she uses computational modeling, behavioral economic paradigms, and neuroimaging to understand both the neural and behavioral mechanisms that underlie risky decision-making, specifically in the health domain, across the lifespan. Since her research is in the developmental area, a lot of her research actually focuses on adolescence, which, if you remember your own adolescence, was probably a time of riskier decision-making than now. And we talk about the neurobiology behind risky decision-making in adolescence, as well as the computational mechanisms that underlie these decisions. So what exactly is going on in the brains of these adolescents to have them adopt these types of decision-making strategies? This was a fun episode, and I hope you take time to bask in some of your own risky decision-making memories from your adolescence. And Beth and I will also be sharing some stories about that time in our lives as well. So I hope you enjoy.
My name is Nina Lauharatanahirun. I know that's a very long last name. And I am an assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering and Biobehavioral Health at Penn State University. I've been here for a couple of years now. And what my research group studies is decision-making, specifically how the brain makes decisions. And my lab is called the Decision Neuroscience Lab. And so in our lab, decision-making is really broad, but we're really interested in understanding decision-making from a value-based decision-making framework that is an interdisciplinary approach that combines behavioral economics, psychology, computer science, engineering, and neuroscience to study the cognitive and psychological processes that different decision-making processes, specifically under situations of uncertainty. And we're hoping that we can study these basic processes to try and develop engineered solutions for optimizing health decision-making. We make almost our entire lives are made of decisions. And so improving how we make those choices and understanding the processes that go into those choices will hopefully enable us to develop some translational stuff on the applied end within the lab. So that's kind of what we do.
So just to follow up on what your general framework is, could you say a little bit more about what you mean by value-based decision-making? Is the idea, and we'll get into details later, but is the idea kind of trying to see how much people value different types of outcomes more than others? So like choosing an apple.
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. So when I say valuation, I think finance people really understand that term well because they have to put numbers to different options. But our brain is doing the same thing. So when we are making decisions, we have computations associated with those decisions. And individual brains are doing these computations differently based on the things that they care about. So like you just gave an example, Ava, of an apple. Well, I might not prefer apples, right? I might prefer oranges. And so how do we build in those preferences or those values that we have that guide our decision making? And so what we do in the lab is we often give people decision-making tasks that are based off of money because we know that people value money, and money is something that we don't have to subjectively determine. What $1 means to you might mean something different to me, but $1 is $1, and how we spend that dollar might be different, but that value is consistent at least. So we use this economic framework and we give people pairs of decisions, and we build computational models or mathematical hypotheses about how we think their brains and their cognitive processes are actually subjectively valuing different options, with the idea being the option that if you're presented with apples or oranges, you will choose the option that you subjectively value the most. So that is the assumption, that we make, and you can build in anything into those models, right? Anything into those subjective values. So it maybe is just apples and oranges now, but maybe I'm a pessimist or optimist, or maybe I really, really care about the likelihoods of specific outcomes or the magnitude of the reward that I get from those decisions. So there's lots of different things that go on in that subjective valuation process. Like when we're making a decision, we're constantly weighing the benefits, the costs, and then thinking about immediate rewards versus long-term rewards. So all of those things can be modeled in a precise way. And I think how we've studied decision making in psychology traditionally has been to ask people about these preferences that they have and then relate those perceptions to actual decisions or behaviors that people engage in. And while that is so helpful, at least in adolescence, which is a period that we are really interested in the lab, a lot of these kids don't really have the language or even self-awareness of what is guiding those decisions. They're like, I don't know, I just like apples. That's why I chose it. They don't have that introspection. I think some adolescents do and some don't. And so it's something that they're developing. It's a skill that we have as adults to be able to introspect and be more self-aware about what we really want. I mean, I feel like we're all still searching for ourselves, right? And we evolve. And so that changes. And when we give people these decisions, we are basically backing out their preferences from the choices that they make. Instead of asking them, hey, how risky are you? Can you tell me today how risky you are? We actually look at their decisions and we apply a computational model to their choices based on a hypothesis that we have. And then we estimate what their preferences are, and then we fit that to their actual data.
So since you touched on the fact that you're really interested in working with adolescents, before we get into your actual data on this, could you tell us a bit about why adolescence is such a critical time to study decision-making and risky decision-making in particular?
Yes, adolescence is a really awesome time. There are so many changes that are happening, both structurally and functionally, to how the brain is reorganizing itself and learning new things and making new connections. And structurally, the brain is also changing, right? And so these structural functional relationships in the brain actually mature a lot, increase their rate of maturation during adolescence. It's also a time where, as you've probably heard in the public sphere, that adolescence is a time where they make really risky choices. And according to the CDC, at least in the United States, a lot of the health risk behaviors are actually preventable. And these health risk behaviors that adolescents engage in, like driving under the influence, motor vehicle accidents, recreational accidents, all of these health risk behaviors have been related to these outcomes that actually contribute to the leading causes of disease and death in our adolescent population in the US. And so adolescence is supposed to be this premier time when adolescents are transitioning also socially from their families, and their primary social interactions are usually within their family. And now they're actually transitioning to making new friends and developing peer groups and relying on peers for information and not solely on their parents. So it's exposure to new social experiences. And so it's a really exciting time period to study because at so many different levels, there are so many different changes. And one really important statistic that I like to couch my work or contextualize my work before we talk about the actual studies in a talk is that almost half of all psychiatric disorders actually begin during adolescence, but they don't receive treatment until 6 to 20 years later. And that's a really staggering statistic. So a lot of the work, why we're really interested in understanding these sort of basic mechanisms of decision making, is to really understand what might be going awry in some of these psychiatric or mental health conditions that persist into adulthood. And can we identify those processes earlier on, or identify kids that might be vulnerable to having these problems in adulthood? Because it's a public health problem, but it's also a significant economic burden to society.
The last thing I want to ask you before we get into your work is, why is it that these adolescents don't receive treatment at the time where some of these mental health issues start forming? Is it because they're not as crystallized and we're just seeing like the first evidence that something could go much more wrong in the future? Or is it that people don't really think that adolescents are going to have these issues?
Yeah. So I'm not a clinician, so you can take my answer to this with a grain of salt. But I think it's really, really hard to think about even psychiatry in general, at least in the US. When you transition from a child psychiatrist, where you have the development of these more psychological processes or behaviors, and we're basically saying if you experience these types of symptoms, you get this kind of label. At least that's what the DSM allows us to do. And we're trying to do work on really understanding how those symptom clusters are related to neurobiological systems and processes in a more fundamental and basic way. And so it's really hard to, I think, see where these trajectories, like, is this a phase? Is this a developmental phase that someone is going through, where these are behaviors that we're just seeing that are appropriate for this developmental phase that could just be exploration? But oftentimes these patterns of behaviors become habitual and persist into adulthood. And then people seek treatment for them when there's actual dysfunction in their daily life. So a lot of these patterns of behaviors that we might see in children and adolescents, they may not be having a huge negative impact to that child or adolescent's life at the time that it starts, right? But then you see those sort of patterns and behaviors go on throughout their life, and we see them as adults, and you're like, oh, well, now retrospectively looking back, you've had a history of these types of behaviors since you were a young child, right? People also don't treat continuously for their entire lives. So I think clinicians are doing the best job that they can. They get snapshots of a person, and often people see different clinicians over their lifetime. And that information is not always shared across different physicians, clinicians, and it's not like we all talk to one another about the care that someone receives, especially the privacy and confidentiality. And as patients, I don't think we transfer our records all the time either from previous people that we see. And so I think that stop and go of treatment and not continuous treatment, I think makes it difficult to really understand, okay, I'm hearing that it's a problem now, but I don't know if this was a problem earlier on. And maybe you're telling me it's not, but maybe it was there and the patient didn't notice at the time. Anyways, that was a very long-winded answer to say it's a very difficult problem. And I think clinicians rely a lot on their clients to report accurately what they're experiencing and for how long they've been experiencing these things. And I don't think as humans in general, we're really good at approximating that, because we have so many biases and we might be sharing things about ourselves that are not really socially desirable in those situations, especially for adolescents.
So a lot of this sounds like a system structural problem with the way that health issues, I guess, are treated over the lifespan. Or do you think that, I mean, we'll get into this very soon, but do you think that there are some ways to evaluate patterns of behavior in a more predictive way, maybe using these types of computational models that would allow for better diagnosing someone's risk factors later on, risk predisposition?
Yeah, I think we're just so individual, right? And we have all these really rich social and cultural contexts that we live in and that we make choices in. And every brain is different and works differently based on those experiences. Like, our brains are shaped by the experiences that we have, by the genetics that we have, by the interactions that we have on a daily basis, by observing how other people make choices, depending on if those people are important to us. So I think it's just really hard. I don't think our system is bad. I think that we just need more individualized treatment plans that better assess this treatment might work for you, but it might not work for me because that's not the symptoms that I have are because of X abnormality or dysfunction or processing, right? That's happening at the neural level. And what's happening with you might be a completely different process. And so if this treatment is based on what's happening with you, it might not work for me in that way. And so I think we struggle even with our descriptions of these subjective experiences and trying to make them more objective, and understanding those cognitive phenotypes can actually connect different levels of analysis, like things that are happening at the molecular cellular levels in the brain that psychotropic medications are often built off of. That's really impactful. Like, we don't know sometimes why those medications work. We just know we're not going to stop using them because they work. But understanding why they work is really important. And I think understanding these cognitive phenotypes that we are trying to study with social processes, the positive valence system, reward processing, all of these different processes are involved in all types of mental health conditions. And so understanding how those processes might be affected in a particular individual is probably important for developing more individualized treatment plans and where we can see the most gains.
So with that, could you actually tell us a little bit about one of your studies, this really cool longitudinal study where you looked at the neural correlates, which basically just means like patterns of activity in the brain that are associated with a particular process, these neural correlates of risk behaviors in adolescence. And could you talk a little bit about why you did a longitudinal study and the types of methods that you used, so that lottery task, and why you used functional imaging?
So in this study, I'm just going to give a little bit of background to why we did this study to begin with. A lot of the adolescent risky decision-making literature up until this point has really focused on reward processing. And from a value-based decision-making perspective, one of the things that we're really interested in is developing these engineering solutions, right, for improving decision-making behavior. So we really need to focus on not how they're processing rewards after they've made a decision, but really focusing on, okay, how are they evaluating these options? And what types of information are people using to guide the choices that they're making? And maybe that's a better strategy for trying to develop these solutions that will actually improve their health. So that was one of the impetuses of doing this study. And we wanted to do a longitudinal study. This was a longitudinal study that we started when I was doing my graduate work at Virginia Tech in Dr. Brooks King Costas's lab. And in the adult world, we have known that risk and reward are two factors that really influence decision-making. Risk meaning the likelihood or the chance that you're going to get a particular reward. So the odds of receiving that reward. And rewards being the rewards themselves, like maybe some monetary outcome, maybe some social approval or social affirmation from your peer groups. That could also be a type of reward that adolescents are really interested in and value. But a lot of the work in adolescence has really focused on cross-sectional studies. And cross-sectional studies are really just snapshots of particular age ranges. And it's really hard to do longitudinal studies because you have to follow these individuals for years, at least in our case. And so we started this longitudinal study really to understand not only group behavior, but also individuals, and look at how these risk and reward processes, decision-making processes, actually develop and mature across a period of adolescence, middle adolescence, where we see a rise in these health risk behaviors. And so a lot of the work we're doing, we're giving them a laboratory task, and then we're assessing those processes based on that laboratory task. But one of the things we were really interested in this study was really linking those processes that we study in the lab to actual risk behaviors that adolescents were experiencing across a 3-year period. So the study involved 169 adolescents. We recruited them when they were 13 to 14 years old, and then they came back and they were 14 to 15, and then the third year they were 15 to 16. So we covered that peak. About 15 is where we see this increase in risk-taking behaviors from a lot of Lawrence Steinberg and BJ Casey's work. And in neuroimaging in general, we have not looked at longitudinal data analysis. So we wanted to use a whole brain longitudinal neuroimaging pipeline to look at how these brains are actually changing across time and how those changes in those networks that were associated with risk and reward, how those are related to individuals' risk behaviors in the laboratory task, and then how those might be prospectively related to changes that we might see in health risk behaviors over time. So the idea being, okay, we have these kids that are longitudinally, what we're able to do is this allows us to get at cause and effect relationships better than cross-sectional data, because we have temporal precedents where we've studied these kids and we know where they are 15 to 16. I'm not saying that there aren't confounds there, but generally we can get at prospective relationships here. So we wanted to see, does risk-related activity in the brain when they're making these choices at time 1, when they're 13 or 14, does that actually relate to where they end up? Does that explain the variance in health risk behaviors or the change in health risk behaviors using just their time 1 risk processing, their reward processing, behavioral and neural markers of that? And can we see whether or not that's related to change in health risk behaviors over time? And what was so cool about this study is that, one, yes, it's longitudinal, it took a long time to do. 2, we did this whole brain longitudinal neuroimaging analysis that has not been widely used because there aren't a lot of longitudinal studies. And we did see that the risk-related network in adolescence actually got stronger over time, and that how we process risk in these options, when we're looking at risky options, that activates this risk-related circuit or network of brain areas, including the bilateral insular cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, the ventral striatum, which we often see activated during reward processing as well. And that activation gets stronger, or they become more sensitive to risky options as adolescents actually got older, which is really cool. And that those changes in that risk-related activity was related to changes in risk preferences. So adolescents during this period of time in the sample actually became more risk averse. And that risk aversion was related to those changes in risk-related brain activation in the risk-related network. So adolescents who are more risk averse over time were also showing greater sensitivity, higher activation in this risk-related brain network. And we see that for reward sensitivity, we actually see a different trajectory. Adolescents became more risk averse over time during this period, but they also became more reward seeking, which suggests that these two parameters in this economic lottery choice task using this value-based decision-making framework that we use in the lab were actually separable. We do see some neural correlates that are similar, the ventral striatum being one of them, but we looked at how those brain areas and those risk preferences at time 1 then were those related to health risk behaviors over time. And we measured health risk behaviors. These are things like substance use, reckless driving, delinquency, recreational risks. So it was more of a global health risk behaviors not wearing a seatbelt or helmet. And we found that the kids that were least sensitive in their right anterior insular cortex at time 1 had the greatest increase in the change of health risk behaviors by their 3rd year, which suggests, and that was over and above the behavioral risk preference, although that was trending in the same direction, and it was over and above reward sensitivity. And this was controlling for verbal intelligence and pubertal development. And we had a few other statistical controls that we included in the model. But the basic take-home message was that this is potentially a neurovulnerability that helps us identify who may be at risk for engaging in these high levels of risky behavior that may lead to negative health outcomes later on in life. And that is still going on. So now they're in college. So that's really exciting. So we'll get to, we'll see lots more studies from that longitudinal study. And I think it was one of the first longitudinal neuroimaging studies in the United States before HBCD. So that's really cool that we have yearly, because HBCD is every 2 years. And in this sample of kids, we're sampling them every year. And they're also coming from a region of our nation where we don't get a lot of studies about adolescence in those areas, like this rural population of Appalachia. We don't have a lot of studies on these kids. So it's really great to be able to add more diversity to our science and to building a more comprehensive understanding of how these processes might differ across different samples and different ages.
That's a really impressive study. I guess I'll ask you to speculate a little bit on what do you think is going on with that insular cortex? Do you feel like we know enough about what those brain regions are typically involved in?
So the right anterior insular cortex, we weren't surprised that it was lateralized because there are other studies, like the most seminal work in risky decision-making by Martin Paulus's group has found similar lateralized right insular cortex results for risk-related brain responses. Also, I think Anna van Duijvenvoorde, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but she's in her 2015 paper, she also found right anterior insular cortex activation. So this is speculation, obviously post hoc, that the lateralized results of the right insular cortex might be due to asymmetry in the insular cortex with regard to activation of the autonomic nervous system. So there's some work that has shown that the left insular cortex is more related to parasympathetic nervous system activity. So these are our, like, from my anatomy class in high school, like the rest and digest functions. So really, the parasympathetic nervous system is involved in regulatory and maintenance functions, whereas the sympathetic nervous system, which people might be more familiar with, like our fight or flight nervous system, is involved in preparing the body for potentially threatening situations. So this risk-related signal that we see in the anterior insular cortex, we think that that signal is likely guiding us, right? It's a signal that we get from our brain that says, this is a high-risk option. And that signal can either help guide us toward something or away from something that's potentially threatening or harmful. If we think that the insular cortex is involved in guiding individuals away from potentially harmful outcomes, then it might suggest that this right insular cortex is actually involved in an anticipatory response that actually prepares us for avoiding those negative outcomes by activating the autonomic nervous system. That is something that we could definitely study and is a testable hypothesis for future work. I think a lot of work, we don't link our central nervous system work with the autonomic nervous system. I think a lot of studies and a lot of people are trying to do more of that work now. And I think that will be really important for risky decision making, because I think our bodies, we often automatically respond to threats in our environment and things that could potentially harm us automatically and reflexively. And so understanding how those automatic and more reflexive processes are related to how our brains actually process that information to then contribute to this feedback loop that we have. Afferent and efferent feedback loops might help us pinpoint timing of when we're receiving specific input or types of information, when would be the right time to intervene, how would we intervene, what system would we try to intervene on. So I think there's a whole lot of future research that could be addressed there.
That's really interesting. In terms of your findings, I was also wondering if you could speak a little bit more to what you think it means that the teens in the study were becoming more sensitive to reward at the same time that they were becoming more risk averse. Does that just mean that when there's a sure thing, they're more likely to go after it? And does that also translate into like enjoying those things more? And what does that mean for behavior?
I think it's an open question. The interaction of risk and reward is really an interesting future direction that I think a lot of other people are trying to study. The purpose of why we were trying to disentangle, and we used an economic lottery choice task because some tasks don't allow you to actually decompose reward and risk from one another. One of these tasks is the BART task, the balloon analog risk task, which is a great task, and it is related to real world risk behaviors, but it doesn't allow you to decompose what is actually, because in inflating the balloon, risk and reward they're both increasing at the same time. You don't know which one is actually leading someone to make a risky choice or not. So using an economic lottery choice task, we were able to dissociate those two factors that contribute to risky decision making. And I think one of the highlights of that paper is that risk processing and how the brain handles risk information was related to self-reported changes in health risk behaviors over time, over and above reward. So it seems like how people are weighing their chances or their odds of getting a particular reward, at least in this study, was more important in predicting their trajectory in health risk behaviors over time. And that's really important, I think, because it has implications for how we'd want to translate that work. So if adolescents were really focused on rewards and they were really driven to seek out these really high magnitude rewards, then maybe we'd want to try and curb those impulses or do some self-regulation processing, maybe some mindfulness to try and help adolescents build those connections in their brain to try and curb those negative, risky decisions. But if it was risk, which we did find in the paper, I'm not a clinician, but I would think that how adolescents are modeling and observing other people make choices. And we have found in another study that adolescents make safer choices when they're around safer peers. And so how they process that risk information is really important. So maybe modeling risk processes as a parent, explaining why you're making a particular risky decision as you're making it to your child or adolescent in your household may be helpful in building those connections and reducing potentially negative behaviors or maybe enhancing that risk signal. I don't know if that's true. That's like purely conjecture, but that would be an implication potentially of why understanding these two different components actually matter in the real world.
I love listening to Nina's interview, and obviously lots of the things that she was saying and how we should think about interventions and everything resonated a lot with what I'm interested in. And I thought she did an amazing job of explaining the importance behind that. But it also reminded me of this story I have from high school. And I was like, maybe I shouldn't talk about this because maybe this is like too gnarly, not in a good way, in like a bad way. But then I thought, you guys want to hear, well, I don't know if you guys want to hear about country Australia, but it's kind of interesting because I don't think this would happen in other places. Maybe it would. Maybe you'd be like, oh yeah, we all did this too. So this is my country high school, not my city high school. But in my country high school, when we were 15, 16, we were doing this class, legal studies, where you learn about the laws. And we all went and met prisoners. And there's a reason why I'm going to give this story and risky decision making, so just bear with me. But it had like the biggest impact on me ever because we went to the prison. It was a male prison. It was medium security. It would have to been. We went 5 male prisoners. Like we sat with them. We met a murderer and he admitted to doing it and would do it again because we were allowed to ask them anything. And we were a bunch of 15, 16-year-olds. A murderer, someone who was culpable driving. So that's when you're driving under the influence and killed their cousin.
Whoa.
We met, it was really, really awful. And he wasn't okay. It was really, really sad and was really open about it was just devastating. Someone who committed armed robbery. He said it wasn't a loaded gun, but like you could ask them all these details about their crimes. And someone who had committed fraud. And it was really funny because he was very charming and convinced us all that he didn't do it. And at the end, we were like to the prison guards, like, oh, I think it wasn't. And they're like, remember, he is good at convincing you guys of the story he wants. Wow. Like, that's how he committed all that fraud. Like a pyramid scheme of taking money from people. And apparently this program would have issues where people would end up writing to the prisoners, like these high school students. So I'm not sure if this is still going. And I feel like this would not now, like, I don't know, because it wasn't really checked in if like how we felt about all this. And it was crazy because we could just ask them anything. And speaking to the murderer was like, as you can imagine, so hectic. And 15, 16, obviously this had a really big impact on someone like me because I was like, oh my God. And I'll never forget these guys or their faces or the things that they said or the things that the guys in class were asking these men. They just weren't afraid. So they asked like details about the murder. And I don't understand Ava's faces. I don't understand how that was all allowed. But country Australia can sometimes be not really up to date with where we really should be. It feels very country Australia-esque.
Well, I feel like maybe you should have some guardrails, like, well, like you don't,
No, we were all sitting around in a circle. It was like,
oh, I meant emotional guardrails, but that's that as well. But I mean, like for you, like Beth can leave if she doesn't want to hear the details of how the murder was committed or something like that, and maybe like check in some therapy or something. But I'm very curious about how it impacted you and what you think about it now, and also maybe how it relates to the stuff that Nina was talking about in terms of what was their goal? Like, were they trying to scare you straight to be like, this is what could happen? Or it was just like, check it out, guys, learning experience.
I think I was like, this is a legal system. Like, this is a prison.
So it was just like, they should learn about the legal system. Oh, maybe if they meet some convicts, like that'd be fun and interesting and engaging learning.
That's what I don't really understand because it was a class studying the law. It was like a legal studies class.
Oh.
So we also went to court cases and stuff, which makes more sense. And then this was kind of in part of those excursions. Like, we'll go to a court case. We'll go and meet some prisoners.
I think that's awesome. I kind of love it. I'm kind of team
country Australia.
Why not? I feel like you get to meet people you otherwise wouldn't meet. I'm into it.
No, you're right. And I'll just never forget when we were all convinced that the fraud man didn't do it. And I was like, yeah, that's right. Can't trust everything they say. But why I'm also telling the story is, so for me, I was so impacted by these men's stories. And apart from maybe the fraud man, but the rest of them, people get into these situations. It was very clear, like, and it was so interesting also because if you didn't know they were in prison or they'd done these things, they were just like anyone. And it definitely had a very humanizing impact on people in prison, like us. I don't know, there was just this thing, I guess, when you're a teenager or something, you're like, oh my God, people who go to prison are this and this and this. And then just sitting with them and talking to them, you're like, oh no, that's not.
That's why I think it's such a good program.
Yeah.
Because you were upset
Yeah,
about
no, and
it,
I think
not because you were face to face with these people that you felt like were monsters, but kind of the opposite reason, that you were like, wow,
no.
this could have been
Yeah.
anyone, and like they were just in the wrong place at
Yes.
the wrong time. Okay.
They didn't seem like monsters at all.
Especially the fraud
Like
guy.
that.
You were like, that's my husband. I will fight to get him out of here if it's the last thing I do.
He was just misunderstood.
I see where a lot of patterns in your life have come from. This one trip to jail.
At 15. But also the man who was in the accident where his cousin died, it was just devastating. And he was just, it's hard to really put into words. And I remember thinking at the time that literally could, like, so many people drive under the influence and don't get in an accident. Like, that happens so often. And this man's whole life has changed. And I remember, so we're teenagers, so we're doing risky decisions, and we also live in the country, so there's a lot of driving going on. And I remember being like, this is so full on. So my decision making from that, I mean, I still can't drive, but I remember thinking a lot about that. And then one of the boys in the class, 1 week later, got caught by the police driving, I can't remember if he was speeding or under the influence, and lost his license. I remember being like, but we just met these people who had this happen to them and it ruined their whole lives, and we were there. And it was just so interesting that we went through all that together. And even though that happened, that didn't impact his decision to then go and drive like that. And when I was listening to this episode about teenagers and risky decisions and the differences, and I was like, yeah, well, that's a clear difference, because that experience definitely scared me straight, but not everyone in that group. And I remember thinking, if you've just gone through that experience and you still make that decision, I'm not sure what would change your decision to do that kind of driving, because what else would you need to see to decide not to do that?
So you feel like that person's reward system was just out of whack?
Yeah.
Do you think they grew out of it?
I'm not sure, because there's a country high school boy, so I'm not really sure. But
if you're listening, contact us. If you recognize yourself from this story, call in. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, because I feel like even with speeding or like driving under the influence, when I think of risk, I guess I think about it as the potential for something to go very wrong, but then also you're gaining something that you presumably want. But in a situation like that, it's like, what exactly is the thing that we want? Like, and how do we conceptualize that reward? Is the reward like a physical enjoyment of like speeding, or like is a reward as simple as something as, oh, I need to get home. I don't really care that I'm drunk. I need to go home. So my reward is just,
or like
simply
the joy. I think there's a reward in like driving fast. Like,
yeah, I think for speeding it makes sense that physiologically you're like, yes, I want to do this. But driving drunk, I don't know. Neither of us drive, so this is a horrible example for both of us. We cannot contribute any type of life experience to this conversation. But that part of the calculation of the risk, that is a really important aspect of it. And it's like, is it that someone would see that risk as either unlikely, so I don't think that that's going to happen to me, I don't believe that negative outcome is probable for me, or is it that they think, oh, even if that negative outcome happens, it wouldn't be that bad? I think the way Nina thinks about it is that it's the probability of the outcome, and maybe in this case it would be like dying from driving drunk. But I think it is like, when you're a teenager, it does feel, at least in like a lived experience kind of way, and like what people tend to say is that you just feel like you're invincible. So it's like, I think there's a 0% chance that I would die, or a 0% chance that this bad thing would happen. And the bad thing doesn't even feel like a true potential outcome, because you're like, who's going to catch me? Who's going to stop me? I'm going too fast. They're never going to catch me.
No one's going to get me. No, I 100% agree. And when I was listening to this, I think that changes the older you get, because I'm 5 years older than you, Ava.
And we're 1 day apart. Our birthday's 1 day apart, in case anyone wants to get us a present.
Isn't that cute? Geminis. But even the older I get, I notice I want to do less risky things. I used to just run off into the ocean, swim around, not think of it all. And the older I get, I'm like, no, I don't want to. It's just so interesting, that change. Traveling, you just become more afraid. Well, maybe not everyone, but I've noticed becoming more afraid. And I'm interested how you feel, Ava, because I feel like when I was your age, I still was like, woohoo, I'm invincible. I can swim around and do whatever. And then late 20s, early 30s, you're like, I don't think so.
I think, I mean, from what you're saying, it does sound like it's really about that calculation of how likely is it that the bad thing's going to happen. And when you're young, it's like the bad thing isn't even in your mind. So you're not even like, oh, if I got stung by a jellyfish, how bad would it be? You're just like, I'm not going to get stung by a jellyfish. Like, no shark is coming at me. I know that you've had more flight anxiety. I think sometimes I'll have anxiety, but sometimes I just think, could it be today that my plane is going to crash? Sometimes I'm like, I don't think so. It just doesn't feel right. But there are other days where I do really, if something triggers me, I'm like, wow, this plane is going down. Like, it's happening. So I don't know, but I don't know if that's really changed.
Yeah, okay. I was going to ask, have you noticed things like that changing as you get older?
I don't think so. But I have to say, as a teen, I don't really feel like I took that many risky decisions. I feel like it's a pretty good
that's
kid.
the other thing. I wasn't super risky as a teenager either. I went to prison and then never did anything.
What a soundbite. Wow. I went to prison and never did anything bad again. I do feel, okay, I'm looking back at my teen years and I actually think I take back a lot of what I said. I wasn't doing anything super dangerous, but I definitely think I was engaging in activities that I just wouldn't do now. But it's hard to say, is it social? Is it the brain? I guess it's all wrapped up together.
Are we just more tired?
Yeah.
Like, I'm just more tired. Is it just that?
One thing that I've noticed, this has nothing to do with risky decision making, but that made me feel so old, is when I used to listen to music, I would do a lot of like stories. You know, I'd like look out the window dramatically and think about like a future boyfriend that would break up with me or cheat on me or something. Like, I'm a dramatic girly. And I would always think about, oh, like maybe like my ex-boyfriend or something. Or I would imagine, oh, the guy I'm dating now, like maybe we'll break up and then this will be the sad story of our demise or something like that. And then I was going on a walk the other day and I was listening to some Drake song. And instead of thinking about a boy, I was like, wow, this is so much like my relationship with my coworker. And I was like, whoa, oh, I'm so old that now I'm like moodily going through these songs being like, yeah, that's me and my workers.
I don't know if that's old or just showing that you're too worried about work.
Whoa.
Because I don't I don't have that.
But I also just feel like drama now is about work. It's not about,
right.
You know? And I was like, damn, that sucks.
Yeah.
I think that's actually, you know what? Okay, this is my hot take of the episode. I think that the fact that people don't take enough risk, and maybe like our adolescent brains wouldn't have done this and things would have gone better in our society. I do think that in work, people don't take enough risks in the sense of like, they don't want to confront things that are maybe going on in their workplace directly to each other. And I mean, I guess teenagers are like catty and talk behind each other's backs too, but I feel like people are really risk averse and want to keep harmony at the cost of actually making progress. So maybe I think instead of trying to decrease risky decision making in adolescence, we should increase our risky decision making in the workplace. And that's my capitalist tech bro TED talk.
I was gonna say
that's my hot take.
We're gonna get you out of California.
Oh my god. I'm assuming we don't want to go too far in either direction, right? And it's probably really important for adolescents also to somewhat loosen their risk sensitivity because they are like going into all these new spaces. And if they don't do that, then maybe they won't be able to expand as much as they could if they were taking these risks and going to the party and trying to make new friends. So yeah, can you talk a little about that and the balance between these?
Yeah,
processes?
so I have an undergraduate in the lab, Olivia Pena, who did her senior honors thesis project on this exact question. So in this study, we were interested in risk perceptions from adolescents, health promotion behaviors, so things like raising your hand in class, initiating talking with a stranger, trying out for sports. All of those are risky behaviors. They have potentially negative consequences, but they're also really great consequences. You know, if you play sports, you might make new friends, you will learn new skills. But you could also get rejected if you don't make the team. If you try out for a sports team and you might get socially rejected, maybe you don't fit in with that crowd. You could also get physically hurt from some sports. So that's also really risky. But it's really important to do, I think risky decision making gets a really bad rap, and we often associate it with things that can harm us. And that's because usually we're trying to find ways to prevent it or help adolescents make better choices. But they also do need to engage in risky decision making to learn. It's super important for them to learn from good risk-taking behaviors as well. And we call those health promotion behaviors. So the examples that I gave, like standing up for someone, one of your friends, maybe talking to new strangers or initiating conversation with people you don't know, trying out for sports. And so we asked adolescents to engage in this estimation likelihood task where we had a separate sample of adolescents. I think there were 379 adolescents in that sample. And we basically calculated conditional probabilities of, if you do this behavior, if you drink, what's the likelihood that you got caught by your parents? Or what's the likelihood if you tried out for sports that you'd make the team? What's the likelihood that if I initiated a conversation with someone I didn't know, what's the likelihood that I would get rejected from those peers? And so we presented these behavior outcome combinations. And so the behaviors were either these health promotion behaviors or these health risk behaviors. And the outcomes were either positive or negative. And we asked adolescents to tell us what their estimations are in these different conditions. And then we gave them feedback from another sample of adolescents that said, this is what the actual likelihood is of these behavior outcome combinations from people that are like you. And we did this twice. And the reason why we did this twice was because we wanted to see whether or not adolescents, one, do they have different risk perceptions for health risk behaviors that are potentially negative and these more positive health promotion behaviors? And when they're given information that challenges those risk perceptions or their beliefs, how much of that information do they incorporate into their existing beliefs? And so we're writing this up now, which is really exciting. But we basically found that adolescents have this really positive bias. These are normative adolescents, healthy. They don't have any aberrant patterns of behavior that we know of. And they think that in the health promotion behaviors, that the positive outcomes are really likely to happen and the negative outcomes are really less likely to happen. And for the health risk behaviors, we also found an interaction between behavior and outcome. And they reported that they think it's more likely that the negative outcomes will happen for negative health risk behaviors versus the positive ones. And so from that behavioral study, we basically found that adolescents exhibit this bias, and they also incorporate or they update differently based on the different types of behavior outcome combination, which is really important for like health communication messaging. So one of the results that we found from that study, which has not been published, was that when adolescents who had this really positive bias, that is protective. It's really good that we think that the negative outcomes are really likely to happen because that likely prevents us from doing those bad things, like using substances or drinking and driving or things like that. And when we gave them information where it was lower than what they expected, they actually updated their perceptions to the lower numbers, which means that maybe giving information about the statistics or how likely, if that's different than what if they're updating towards the actual information or statistic and that information is less than what they thought, that could actually potentially have the opposite effect of what we want from public health communications. So that was a really cool study that we did, and I think has potential for direct translation. And just a plug for human researchers in general, I think one of the really cool things about doing human neuroscience or human psychology research is that a lot of the work that we study can be directly translated in our lifetimes to the population that we're interested in studying, right? We're all interested in hopefully making people's lives better, improving cognitive function, social function, in my case, decision making, better for humans, so especially in the health space. So I think this work contributes to that mission.
It's nice to hear that adolescents they seem to be doing okay. Like they seem to be protecting themselves and
and
thinking in ways that their parents would be happy about.
Yeah, most adolescents are just fine, right? You and I are just fine. We ended up okay. And there's obviously social and cultural factors like SES we've shown in parental monitoring. So how much parental monitoring that you have in your household can actually affect this risk signal in your brain, particularly in the right insular cortex. So that's also really important to know that these social and cultural factors affect the signal, because then we can actually engineer the right social environment or the right types of factors that would actually encourage the right types of behaviors. And so I think that's really important. Often we focus on like, oh, that's really depressing. We found that, if you have low parental monitoring and you have a lot of chaos in your household, that you don't have a really good risk signal. But our brains are really adaptive and they change and evolve based on our experiences. So we can totally shape those connections. And I think that's really promising, especially during the period of adolescence when their brains are still developing.
So I know your lab has a ton of other directions that we didn't get to talk to because all your work is so rich. But if you could just tell us a little bit about where the lab is going next and things that you're excited about.
Oh, I'm so excited to talk about this. I can't wait for all of the cool projects. We're actively collecting data for 3 different projects now in the lab. And so I'm so excited to see what those results will tell us about the adolescent brain and risky decision making. But one area that I'm particularly excited about is a lot of the adolescent risky decision making literature has focused on studying risk in non-social contexts. But we all know that we make risky decisions, especially adolescents, in social contexts. And so we're using computational models and neuroimaging techniques to really understand the differences between how the brain processes social risk information from non-social risk information. And do those separate preferences actually relate to different health risk behaviors and those trajectories differently? So that's really exciting. And then the second area of research that I'm super excited about is really focused on scaling up. So we study individuals and how individuals make risky decisions, or maybe how individuals make risky decisions for others, or how they make risky decisions in the presence of others. But really, we are interested in studying group dynamics, which we all do in our daily lives, from businesses to academic science teams to engineering teams that have to work together. How do we, who all have different risk preferences, how do we come together and actually perform? What is the right combination or level of risk preference that you need on a team to actually give you optimal performance? And does that optimal performance actually differ depending on context? So maybe you're working on a creativity solution, and so you might expect that you need lots of risk seekers. We have some preliminary data on this where you need lots of risky people to just brainstorm different ideas and to get a creative solution, versus like problem solving, having diversity of risk preferences or diversity of different types of perspectives are important for coming up with different types of solutions to problems. So those are the spaces that we're working in now, doing hyperscanning and multimodal data collection. So we're really excited to be in the social domain and building off of a lot of the work that we've done longitudinally in this non-social area. It's going to be really exciting to see what we find in the social domain.
Thank you to Dr. Nina Lauharatanahirun for joining us this episode. Our intro and outro music is Nobody Stayed for the DJ by Glacio. Our transition music is Back for More, also by Glacio. Minds Matter is mixed, edited, and created by Beth Fisher, she's the Australian one, and me, Ava Madasuza. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode, but in the meantime, find all our episodes and show notes on mindsmatterpodcast.com.